Good evening. My name is Marty Colburn. I'm the National Democratic Institute's Chief Technology Officer. NDI operates in 55 countries promoting democracy around the globe. We're privileged and honored to be hosted by NYU, DC, and privileged to have Mei talk a little bit about some of her background, and more importantly, what she's done recently, having written a very impactful book. I'm going to first introduce Chris Doughton. He'll be questioning and grilling Anne on how she made it to social impact. Chris is the National Democratic Institute's Chief Innovation Officer. He runs technology for most of our programmatic work at NDI, and what that means is really making sure that the technology that we build is very impactful. And Anne will talk a lot about this in her discussion, but he looks at ideas and inventions and really takes them to market, and that really is that definition of innovation and very much spelled out in Anne's book. He specializes in internet freedom, cybersecurity, and closed societies, and has worked with many at-risk digital activists. He's also been participatory in a number of political campaigns, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. He's also very much a skilled technologist. So Chris really started out his career as a network engineer and then continued to build out development skills to actually take products to market. He's probably one of my favorite colleagues at NDI as he's able to take an idea and really take it to implementation. My background, having been in the private sector most of my career, I spent time at companies like NASDAQ and Fannie Mae and Marriott. I watched Silicon Valley really kind of develop products and take them to market and took advantage of that. I watched early kind of definitions of how you take products to market be encapsulated in books such as Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore and then revolutionized by Eric Ries and Lean Startup. And I think what Anne's done is really taken it to the next level. So in Silicon Valley, they kind of think about paradigm shifts, and I think that that's what she's really done with Lean Impact. If you've not had a chance to read it yet, you'll find it riveting. I couldn't put it down when I read this. It really incorporates a lot of her background in Silicon Valley in some of the early work she did with startups all the way to Google, and then really pushed that into the social impact side of the house. So really taking these concepts, very important. One of the things that I took away from the book is when you get involved in not-for-profits and you get involved in things we do, you have grants and sub-grants, and it's usually a dollar in, dollar out tied to donors, and they don't always see how you actually take product to market and how you would create a minimally viable product and then take that from an idea to implementation. So it's very important, I think, when you think about the work she's done to be able to take that and turn it really into almost a playbook, if you will. And that's really how I saw her book, almost as a playbook. Anne is a leading advocate for social innovation. She brings together unique insights from, again, the work she's done with not-for-profits and the U.S. government. She was the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID. She served as the first executive director at the U.S. Global Development Lab. Really engaged all the practices she learned in Silicon Valley to accelerate impact, and more importantly, to look at the intractable challenges that you have when you're trying to take these ideas and move them to this kind of public sector work. She was also Chief Innovation Officer at Mercy Corps, Advisor for Women in Technology in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, and really kind of pivoted to the social sector. So she's got more than 20 plus years experience in Silicon Valley and is now building really a reputation in that social good field. She's been recognized by a number of different organizations. The one that is most impactful for me, Women in the World, 125 Women of Impact. That was Daily Beast in 2013. She's also been a keynote at a number of different major conferences, TEDx, Mid-Atlantic, South by Southwest, Social Good Summit, Lean Startup Week. So she's got just a diverse background and just very impactful, very important in what we do at NDI. So we're going to take a lot of her lessons and apply those. Chris and I are just pleased to actually had a chance to meet Anne and seen some of the work that she's done. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Anne to talk a little bit about some of the work she's done.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Marty. And thank you for actually reading the book. And I'm impressed. I really appreciate your feedback. And thank you, Chris, for putting this whole thing together. Thanks to NDI and NYU and all of you for coming here despite the beautiful weather outside. If I wasn't speaking, I would probably be out there. So I'm wondering, how many of you feel like we're at a critical juncture when it comes to global development? Does anyone else feel that way? I'm just seeing a lot of trends that I think are really calling to question kind of what we've been doing and how we've been doing it and how do we make progress going forward. And just to illustrate a few of those trends, one is that certainly we know about the SDGs. We also know that already just a few years in, we're already falling short, that the trajectory we're on, we're unlikely to make many of them. And so we know our solutions are insufficient. We also, as folks here probably know very well, that more and more of global poverty, of some of the development challenges are concentrating in fragile states, which are unpredictable and difficult places to work. The advent of technology and automation and AI is changing everything around us, including the very nature of work. And it's causing, digital technologies in particular, are causing the pace of progress to continue to accelerate, where things are changing faster and faster around us, and it's really hard to keep up. Funding is changing too, whereas it used to be that foreign aid was a big part of global development. Today, private sector accounts for an estimated 10 times as much, and local domestic resource mobilization accounts for 3 times greater even than that. And with the rise of nationalism, even the funding that we do have for foreign aid is continually under threat, as we see in this country and in countries around the world, as countries continue to turn inward. And so amidst all of this, I think one theme is clear to me, is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And the good news is that the Lean Startup, a book by Eric Ries, that came out of Silicon Valley 7-8 years ago, really captured some of the best practice for innovation that are intended to deal with uncertainty. And you can imagine that there's a lot of uncertainty when you're a Silicon Valley tech company trying to create something people have never created before. And I would argue these tools are even more important when it comes to global development, because we have huge challenges, solutions that are often insufficient. And we need to figure out better ways to address these needs, and they're really, really important in the world. And so despite that, though, I know so many leaders in global development that know about these types of practices, whether it's the human-centered design or lean startup or other innovation tools, and they make common sense. I think everyone sort of thinks, these are things that make sense, but yet I hear so many people get stuck. That despite a lot of these practices making sense, we have to contend with challenges like highly restrictive funding or impact that is difficult to measure and can take years to realize, or where the whole notion of experimentation can feel irresponsible when you're talking about working with vulnerable populations. And so that's really why I wrote this book, is to look at how do we adapt and translate some of these best practices for the context that we work in global development in the social sector more broadly. And so in writing the book, I was lucky to interview over 200 organizations, both big and small, nonprofit and for-profit, domestic and international, funders and nonprofits, and tried to distill from the best what were the secrets of their success. And I came up with 3 core principles that I'll kind of walk through briefly as just context before we sit down for the conversation. The first is to think big. Now, when I came from the tech world into the world of global development, I knew I had a lot to learn. One of the things that really struck me was how much people here like to plan. Does that happen in your organizations? And what we do is we tend to plan within constraints. Somebody gives us a number of dollars, a number of people, and then we think within these constraints, what can we do? And usually we're able to do some good. We help some people, we improve some things. But in the macro sense, rarely is it enough to really solve the problems at hand. And so the first thing I think we need to flip is to, instead of planning based on constraints, to plan based on the need. What is needed in the world? What does transformation look like? What is it required to reach the SDGs? And if we plan based on the needs in the world, I think we'll oftentimes come up with a very different approach. To put that in context, over the last 30 years, we've made slow but steady progress on some of the common things we work on in global development, such as access to clean water and electricity and sanitation. But during the same period of time, adoption of mobile phones has skyrocketed. And so my question is, how do we aim for a trajectory that looks more like that? And certainly they're very different, but what I would argue is that mobile phones reach those same poor people living in rural areas that we were trying to reach with all these basic services, and yet somehow it really took off. And I think that certainly not everything's going to look like the adoption of mobile phones. A lot of the things we work on are very different than that, but I think we need to aim that high. And so let me take it out of the technology realm and talk about a nonprofit, social enterprise called Vision Spring. So a lot of people think of innovation as like the whiz-bang technology and equate innovation and technology. I actually think that the definition of innovation is not technology, it's not a whiz-bang thing, it's something that makes the world dramatically better if we're caring about impact. And so Vision Spring set out and they looked at a 700-year-old invention that has been proven to improve productivity and learning potential, and that's eyeglasses. And despite it being 700 years old and around for 700 years, their estimates are that 2.5 billion people could benefit from eyeglasses that don't have them. 2.5 billion people. And so they set out to try to address this. They started out by running what would be considered probably a typical program where they hired people they called vision entrepreneurs to do outreach into rural areas to provide vision care for people and provide low-cost glasses. They had lots of success in coming back with great stories of people who were able to be productive and work again, kids who were able to learn. And from a traditional program standpoint, in many ways, it was a great success. However, they realized that they were losing money with everybody they reached, and they would never get anywhere close to their goal. And so their first pivot was to set up vision centers in more urban areas so that they could serve a more affluent population, take the proceeds from that, the profits from that, and plow it into outreach to more rural areas. And through that, they became financially self-sustainable, which is, I think something that we often aspire to. We're doing good and we're financially sustainable, but yet they kept thinking about that 2.5 billion number and realized that it would take them decades, if not centuries, to expand their infrastructure to reach that many people. And so they pivoted again. They decided to work through partnerships and leverage the existing networks of organizations such as BRAC in Bangladesh that has community healthcare workers across the country, and leverage these existing networks rather than building their own to deliver their services and get out to more places. And so through these kinds of partnerships, they were able to reach now, I think, almost 5 million pairs of glasses that they've distributed. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? 5 million pairs of glasses, people are working, people that weren't able to work, kids are learning. But 5 million is a tiny fraction of 2.5 billion. And so they realized that they were not making enough progress towards their goal, and they needed to take a different approach. So their most recent pivot was that they decided to set up a public-private partnership called the iAlliance that brings together eyeglass manufacturers, governments, and nonprofits to really address the systemic issues behind access to eyeglasses. And in recognizing that this is not a problem that any one organization is going to solve alone, but that there are market failures, there's policy failures, and an example of an early success was an MOU they signed with the government of Liberia to integrate vision care services into their public health system and their public school system. So you can imagine as they start tackling these issues at a system level that they'll hopefully start getting closer and closer to that 2.5 billion number. But it's by setting setting that audacious goal, the 2.5 billion number, and keeping their eyes focused on that goal, that's forced them to continue to make these pivots in order to get there. And so I think that audacious goal, again, this is only one example of one path of what one organization did, but having that audacious goal, I think, is a starting point to force us to think about how we're going to get there. So once we have that goal, once we have a potential solution, the temptation is to start executing as fast as we can. But the second principle of lean impact is to start small, because there's a real trade-off between the investment we make in rolling something out to as many people as possible and the learnings that we can get by testing, by staying small and testing, iterating, and improving what we have. And in my experience, by starting small, we can make a much bigger impact in the long term. And so at the core of starting small is, and the core of lean impact is something Eric calls the build, measure, learn feedback loop in lean startup. And this is not some new fad. This is essentially an entrepreneurial version of the scientific method. The idea is that if you have a potential solution, then you have a hypothesis of what you think is going to happen when you deploy your solution. And the build, measure, learn feedback loop is simply to say, let's test that hypothesis. Let's build an experiment, the smallest possible experiment that will help you learn something about your hypothesis. Not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but just learn something about it. That's something Eric calls an MVP, or minimum viable product, something that we try to do in the order of days or weeks. Then we measure. We gather data to see what worked, what didn't work, and then we learn. If our solution was successful, then maybe we can double down and do more, and, offer it to more people, do it at a higher fidelity. If it didn't work, maybe we can adjust it, adapt it, tweak it, and test it again. Or we might recognize we're on the wrong path entirely. But the key to this is how quickly we can drive through this loop. We spend a lot of time in global development planning trying to come up with the best solution, the best design. I would argue we need to spend more time figuring out how do we become more agile and be able to learn more quickly. Because in my experience, even at places like Google, which is one of the most innovative companies on the planet, we don't always come up with the right answers there. But what Google's really good at is iterating quickly so that they learn quickly and improve quickly to have their products be better and better over time. And so I think the key is how do we integrate some of that into the work that we do. And so just to give one example, I just got back, I was at the Skoll World Forum last week, which celebrates social entrepreneurship, and one of the awardees was Harambee Youth Accelerator from South Africa. And they're trying to tackle this scourge of youth unemployment, where it's a huge issue in South Africa. Something like 40% of youth are not in education or employment or training. And so, they had a big goal. And what they decided to do was try to figure out how to bridge the gap of helping youth get their first job in the formal sector and set them on a path to having financial stability in their lifetimes. And they had a hypothesis that they could provide some training to help youth become job ready, and then help them connect them to job opportunities. But then also work on the employer side to help employers connect with appropriate youth for the kinds of jobs they had. And their MVP, before, I think a lot of organizations do stuff like this, but we tend to, again, plan elaborate programs. Their MVP involved not hiring any staff. They worked with a consulting firm to put together training. They worked with a temp agency to find some unemployed youth and to see what would happen. And they found one employer, and they ran a training. They had like 30 youth in the training, ran them through, see if they could get jobs. And to see if this would even work. The first thing that they learned was that when they did the traditional thing of using assessments on English and math to see, to select youth, they found that a lot of the youth couldn't pass these tests because the education system was failing them. So instead, one of their early pivots was they decided to focus on learning potential instead, that they came up with different tests that would assess learning potential and then use their training to help bridge that gap. The second thing was that they learned that they were able to place youth with employers. And so they were able to be successful there and then started developing their own training curriculum and hiring their own staff and getting their own facilities. But they also realized that for long-term impact, they needed to focus on making sure youth were not only getting trained, not only getting jobs, but were staying in jobs. Because if youth were staying in a job for at least a year, then they would be, the studies had shown that that would put them on a long-term path to success. And so they not only measured did youth get jobs, but they looked at were youth staying in the jobs. And what they found was that in some cases they weren't. For example, they would place youth in retail stores, like a checkout clerk at a grocery store, and they would find that many of them after a few weeks would leave. They would quit their jobs. So they looked into this, and what they found was that the youth were not accustomed to standing all day. It was not something they were used to, not something they were expecting, and they were just fed up with it and left. And so as a result of that, they decided to look at, well, what can we do about this? Hi. I think it was not the mic, but something else. Okay, I will keep talking then. So these youth were leaving their jobs, and so they decided that they would modify their training. And instead, in their training, they had the youth for the 3 weeks of the training stand. So they would become accustomed to this idea of standing. It's a very simple tweak, but it was only by looking into the data, finding out that the youth were leaving their jobs and why they were leaving their jobs, that they recognized that this was an adjustment that they could make. And it resulted in youth staying in the jobs, the retention rate going up significantly. And so for successful social innovation, what we need to think about is delivering on 3 pillars of what makes a successful social innovation: value, growth, and impact. Now, value is the question of, is this not only something that people want, but is it something they'll demand, come back for, tell their friends about? Does it feel a deeply felt need for folks? I think this is a real challenge when it comes to the nonprofit world, because our customers are often different than our beneficiaries. If it's something that feels a deeply felt need, we also need to ask the question about impact, which is, does it work? Does what I'm doing deliver the social benefit that I'm seeking, and to the extent that is needed? And finally, we need to ask the question about growth, which is, if it's something people need and it's something that that works and makes a difference, how do we get it out to all the people who could benefit? And so at the core of lean impact is this idea of testing our assumptions and optimizing what we deliver around value, growth, and impact. And what I found is a lot of the techniques that are out there, a lot of the organizations that are out there are really good at 1 or maybe 2 of these, but rarely all 3. And so where we fall down is usually on the 3rd. But what I've seen in the research that I've done is that in order to really move the needle, we need to be able to do all 3 of these. So the final principle of lean impact is to relentlessly seek impact. And this may seem like an obvious thing, but what I've been surprised by is how often we lose sight of this. One of the reasons is that we forget to stay in love with our problem and instead fall in love with our solution. Whether that solution is a particular technology, a particular design that we have pride of ownership in, a particular role for ourselves or our organization. And we stop focusing on the problem. And is this really moving the needle on the problem? One of the things that helps to do that is to really focus on the metrics that matter. Eric talks about these metrics on the left, these absolute numbers that sound really good but don't mean very much, as vanity metrics. You know, the absolute number of the people we've reached, the dollars we've raised. They say that things are happening, but not whether they worked or whether another organization could have done more with the same resources. So instead, if we care about impact, what we need to do is focus on the metrics on the right, which are what I call innovation metrics. And they're the unit level metrics around value, growth, and impact that will pay dividends over time. Things like the adoption rate, the unit cost, the success rate. If we're able to move the needle on those things, then they'll continue to pay dividends. So I'll just end by saying that for private sector companies, they're not satisfied with delivering some profits. Investors aren't happy with that. Executives aren't happy with that. They're expected to, in fact, by regulation, they're expected to maximize profits, maximize shareholder value. And I'll throw a challenge out there that I think that we should raise the bar and hold ourselves to a higher standard in the social sector, which is that we shouldn't be satisfied with delivering some impact. We should hold ourselves and our community to a higher bar of maximizing the impact at scale that we deliver. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anne Mei. Really appreciate it, and very interesting stuff. So, Chris Doughton, delighted to be here with somebody who's a real role model of mine, and so it's an honor to be here today with you, Anne Mei. So, thanks again so much for taking the time with us. And so, before we dig into sort of the meat of the book, which is fantastic and very interesting and available for sale after this event, so I encourage you all to stick around for that. Tell us a little bit about the writing of it in the first place. It seems like 200 different organizations. It probably was a bit of a labor of love. Could you tell us about the process of getting to this?
Yeah, well, so it starts with the election in 2016 election. I was working in government at USAID, and all of a sudden it was clear I was going to be out of a job. And so I was trying to, I've had my dream job at the Global Development Lab, where we were really doing a lot of this type of work in the context of USAID and looking at how do we transform global development. And so when I realized I was going to be out of the job, I thought, like, what could I do? I started looking actually at, what most of my peers were doing, like jobs at, running an INGO of some sort or something like that. And I realized as I started talking to organizations that being an NGO is tough because you have to work on under so many constraints. I say, like, INGOs don't have a lot of free will. You're so much at the sort of mercy of your funders. And what I really was passionate about is having greater impact. And part of that was about changing the system. So my systems change was writing a book to not invent something new per se, but try to put together a framework and some language to help all the people who are out there who are trying to push against the way the system works today, to hopefully build a movement where we can work in a different way that we all know will be more productive. And so the funnest part of writing the book actually was doing the interviews. I spent about 6 months talking to every organization I could think of, the smartest people I knew, who they thought were the best organizations out there, and just tried to learn. And it was so much fun and inspiring talking to these organizations and hearing what they were doing. And then it took me about 6 months to write the book itself. And I did this full time, which I don't know how people do books when they're working at the same time. I don't think I could have done that. And then it took another 6 months or so for the book to come out. And so it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too. I felt like I learned so much, and it's also been fun just coming out to audiences like this and really hearing how people are responding, hearing people's stories, hearing the challenges people are facing in trying to do these things in their own organizations.
That's great, really cool. And backing up a few years, how did you get into the social impact space to begin with? Like, why did you decide to leave kind of the kind of the Silicon Valley milieu and come into places like Mercy Corps and eventually USAID?
I had made a decision in my mid-20s that I wanted to spend the first half of my career in Silicon Valley in tech, in the private sector, and the second half of my career doing something to make the world a better place, because I felt like, that mattered. And I didn't want to spend my whole life just trying to make money. So even though Silicon Valley was a fun place to work and a really inspiring place to work, I really wanted to do some good. And so that's how I decided to do it. And as I got closer to that point in my career where I was ready to make the change, I started asking myself, like, what would that look like? And what do I want to work on? And global poverty, global development seemed at the root of so many of the things I cared about in the world. And so I started to head down that path, very naively initially, because I literally knew nothing. My first job out of Google was as a fellow at the State Department. And part of the reason I ended up in the Office of Global Women's Issues is it was literally the only department I knew the name of. So when I was asked where I wanted to go work, that was what I said, because I didn't know what, I'd never met anyone in government.
That's remarkable. Yeah, and it's an interesting perspective. I guess following up on that, I'd be curious on that last point, how you feel like that may have changed over the last few years or since you first came into government. NDI has a small office in Silicon Valley trying to engage with the big tech firms. Do you see that changing? Is that a different dynamic these days?
It's definitely shifted some. I think more on the perception of people in DC than people in the Bay Area. I think in government in particular, in the Obama administration with U.S. Digital Services and 18F getting set up, there was a lot more people from Silicon Valley coming. I think when I came initially, I think we could count on one hand, even less than all the fingers on one hand, all the people at Google who had come into government. It was very, very few. And then since then, there's been dozens, I think. And so I think there has been much more of an exchange, but the fascination largely goes one direction. When I was living back in the Bay Area the last couple of years, I felt like a little bit of a tour guide, because every week some like INGO or foundation or government person would call me up and say, hey, we're doing a delegation in the Bay Area to try and soak up some of Silicon Valley. Who should we talk to? But I didn't hear as much from the other direction.
So just to get a little bit of a sense of the audience, how many of you work in or have worked in or study international development? Okay, yeah, a good chunk here, that's great. Yeah, so fascinating book, and so just walking through the big words on the screen behind me here, I think there's interesting challenges to the development sector for kind of each of those big ideas. And so, like, starting with think big, in some ways, you talk about wanting to have that audacious goal. In some ways, I feel like most international development organizations have, at least on their website, an extremely audacious goal, like we're going to end tuberculosis or educate all the women, or a little closer to home, make democracy deliver. But I have a feeling that that's not the kind of audacious goal that you think is kind of actionable. Yeah,
so it's true that I think most organizations are very ambitious in the vision they have, right? So I would say we have more of a vision than a goal in most organizations, because rarely is it measurable, right? It's like, end poverty, I guess end poverty is measurable, but you're not actually holding yourself accountable to ending poverty, right? And so I think that what I see with most organizations is have these squishy goals that are more vision of what they aspire to do rather than the goal that they feel accountable to. And so part of it is just putting numbers on it. Like when Vision Spring stood out to me because they put numbers on it. They said 2.5 billion. It's not like we want the whole world to see, which they could have said, but they said 2.5 billion people don't have eyeglasses, and we're going to figure out how to get it to them. And that's a very different thing to feel ownership of that.
And from the donor space, do you think that there are ways to try and help push development agencies to, the implementers or the people doing this work to think about things in more concrete ways like that?
You mean how donors can help with that?
How donors could, as the funders behind things, how could they help organizations think in those more concrete ways?
I think donors set up so much of the incentives in the system, right? And I think there's definitely, I give donors 80% of the responsibility for trying to move to a world that's more like this, but I think that the INGOs and the implementers still have 20% of the responsibility, so they can't do it alone. But what donors can do is set incentives that are aligned with this, right? That they can do that through prizes that kind of incentivize solutions that really are transformative. They can do it through tiered funding like we did at USAID through DIV and Grand Challenges. DIV is Development Innovation Ventures, where we give out much smaller grants seeking better solutions and then tier up funding based on success and showing evidence of moving towards some of those bigger numbers, bigger successes. We can do it by paying for outcomes, sort of driving greater cost effectiveness in what we do. If I look at most of development programs, whether they're funded by USAID or from any of a number of development funders, most of them are not seeking transformation in trying to find a solution that will address the full problem, will get us to the SDGs. Most of them are looking at chipping away a little bit that's sort of tractable and that's accountable on the side. And the difference I think we need to look at is where we have where we have, let's just take the SDG as an example. So where we have an SDG and we have a path to getting to the SDG, we know pretty much exactly what needs to be done. We just need to do it. Then that sort of grand master plan, execute to the plan, here's where all the pennies are going to be spent, makes total sense. And so where that is the case, which I think is the minority of situations, but where that is the case, we should absolutely execute to a plan. Where we don't know how we're going to get to the SDG or whatever the goal is that we have set, I think we need to take a different approach. And that requires more risk-taking, more flexibility, because we can't just do business as usual, because we're just going to fall short. Well, like Vision Spring, there's so many areas where we have problems that require us to reach 2.5 billion people, and we reach 5 million people, and that sounds great. And I think we just need to recognize that that's not sufficient.
Right, yeah. That's great, yeah. And so thinking about, you mentioned planning and how we all do a lot of planning in this business. One of the conceits in the technology industry these days is this concept of like agile development. You talk about this quite a bit in your book. The idea that you try and work on things in small stages, learn from them, and kind of progressively move towards, away from your minimum viable product, eventually towards your final solution, and learning as you go. Then the antithesis of that is what's called waterfall, that you describe also in your book. And waterfall is where you pre-design all the things. And the international development world is waterfall par excellence. Like,
Yeah, I call it the enforced waterfall model,
That's
because the way the funding works sort of forces you into the waterfall model, even if that's not what you want.
right. And so even under the best of circumstances, you're sitting here in DC, working with your colleagues in the field, you're designing a plan, for like a typical NDI program. Maybe it's a $5 million, 5-year plan that I'm going to write up and I'm going to submit, and I'm going to win or lose based on what I put in that document, and then I'm going to be like legally held to executing on that plan that I submitted, probably 6 months to a year before I even start the work, much less before it all wraps up. So now.
And meanwhile, you're working in fragile states where everything's changed.
Exactly, right, yeah. Sorry, there's a new government. All of our initial assumptions were out the window, but I guess we'll keep trudging along. How do you kind of grapple with that, and the idea of starting small? Because the converse, I totally get it from the funder's side. Like, hey, USAID, I'd like $5 million to work on a really important program in Nigeria, but I don't know what it is. I'm going to do this little thing here, but if you give me the money, then I'll work it out as I go along. So how do you think that we can kind of grapple with some of those challenges?
I think we need to start small. We need to take small steps to get there, right? So one is, rather than, if you have an idea for a democracy program in Nigeria, rather than applying for a $5 million grant, you should apply for a $100,000 grant and try it out first. I think part of the problem is on the nonprofits, on the INGO side, that when we think we're going to experiment, we experiment too big. Most nonprofits, when they think like, oh, I'm going to try something out, they think, I'm going to run a year-long pilot, not I'm going to spend a few $1,000s running a experiment for a few weeks. And so we need to figure out how to ratchet that back and have the investment be commensurate to the risk. And so there is something on the NGO side we need to do. So one is apply for smaller grants. The other is the smaller grant doesn't have to be a separate grant. So this is a key distinction. By being small, it doesn't have to be separate from what you're doing. Another way to do it that I've been really encouraging people to do more of is to say you apply for the $5 million grant. Say, USAID probably has some idea of what they wanted you to do with that money, and you had some traditional program you'd run. Say you tell them 95% of my grant, I'm going to do exactly that. But I'm going to take 5% of the money. I'm going to write in my proposal that I'm going to spend 5% to figure out how to do this better. And here's some ideas I have. If it completely fails, you'll still get 95%. But if I'm successful, if I can make it even 10% better, it's going to more than pay for itself. And hopefully, I believe I can make it twice as good, or 10 times as good. And so then it's an easier sell, right? That you say, hey, I'm not going to waste all your money. At most, I'm going to waste 5% of your money. But there's this huge upside if I succeed. And so I think looking at ways that we can start small within a big program is also really important.
Great. Yeah, and then on the third point there, seeking impact, the concept of vanity versus impact metrics is a really important one. In many ways, in development, it's even more complicated, as you alluded to, and especially like here in the democracy and governance space, it's extraordinarily hard to measure impact, and a lot of the things that you can count really don't count. So any thoughts on how you try and get those measuring sticks that help you evaluate success or failure, especially in the more nebulous sorts of fields in development?
Yeah, I mean, I know democracy is notoriously one of the hardest areas to measure impact. And yet, I believe that everybody still has to create a theory of change, right? That we have some theory of change. And measuring impact and sort of iterating on impact, to me, is really measuring the linkages in your theory of change and testing it. So we often don't test our theory of change except as a whole, right? We say, okay, here's our theory of change. You do A, it leads to B, it leads to C, it leads to D. And so we're going to spend 5 years doing this whole thing, and then we'll see if, like, F comes out the other end, right? And a lot of times it doesn't, but like we're not learning along the way. So the question is, how do we test those linkages each step of the way and optimize those linkages so that we are the most likely to succeed? It's not, we're definitely going to succeed, but if one of those linkages is broken, then we're not going to. And they don't have to happen sequentially. We can do them in parallel. We can take existing research to understand which linkages are more likely to happen or less likely to happen. We can look at the data and try to optimize on each of the linkages, but it's really trying to break it down based on your theory of change and trying to test whether your theory of change is really going to hold true before you go to the full scope of running the, waiting for the whole effect to take place.
So it sounds like this is a bit of the kind of minimum viable product sort of model kind of in the development space of like taking those individual elements in the chain and iterating on that. Can you talk a little bit about other examples, from your book or elsewhere of how people do that well?
Yeah, maybe what might be helpful is if you have an example from in the democracy world that we can talk through that is relevant to your work about how you might do that.
Great. So, so I'll throw out a not hypothetical because it actually happened. So NDI has worked for many years in Liberia, a very difficult place, post-transition, post-Civil War country, and then recently kicked in the teeth again with the Ebola virus and all of the challenges with that. I was tasked as a small part of a larger program in the democratic governance space on legislative strengthening. So we were working with the Legislature of Liberia, and in that grant, kind of like we were describing earlier, written perhaps 3 years before, there was a small piece where they said, we're going to build a legislative website and bill tracking system. Because one of the problems identified was, well, legislators don't communicate with their people very much. Nobody knows what the legislature actually does. So kind of communication gap, and that was thought at the time of the proposal to be an important thing to do. So we had to venture forth and execute on it. So we built out a legislative website. We built out a bill tracking system. They operated more or less during the remaining 2 years of the life of the program. And then shortly thereafter, they were abandoned. All the public fora were overrun with spam bots. The site was eventually hacked. At some point, it went offline. It was not exactly a success. So something like this, any thoughts on how you might have approached this in kind of a lean impact sort of methodology?
Well, first, I just want to commend you for being willing to talk about something that isn't a success. I think one of the challenges in this community is that we don't do that enough. Like every program is successful, right? As far as I can tell.
NDI has been in business for 35 years, and I guarantee you that in 0% of the reports to the donors did we ever have a failure.
Exactly. And so how do we learn? Like, it can't be possible that we're successful all the time because we're working in really challenging environments. Like, it just can't be possible. And so I think that's a great example, right? So traditionally, for a democracy program, there's like, we have a theory. We're going to do these 10 things, and it's going to strengthen, trust in the government and transparency, and that will lead to better democracy or something, right? But there's a theory of change. One of your strands here was that, by having this website, by having legislators post, was it bills, you said? On the website, that people would learn about it, that and so on, it would lead to democracy. Now, we tend to again do all that and then wait several years and at the end to say, did it lead to more democracy? In this case, like some things that you could do earlier, again going back to the value growth and impact hypotheses, is one, if you think that your theory of change is we're going to create this website, people are going to use the website, then they're going to post their bills on the website, then people are going to come to look at those bills. You know, there's a series of things we think will happen in our theory of change. In this case, my sense is, given that people stopped using the website, you know, they couldn't find their password, whatever you were talking about earlier, that maybe the value hypothesis didn't get tested, right? That we were hand-holding people through this because it was on our checklist of things that we're supposed to do in the program. And while the program was running and people were watching over them, they dutifully did these things. But they probably weren't demanding it. They didn't find enough value in it that they were going to keep it up afterwards, right? And so in that case, testing that early linkage and the value hypothesis of, is this something that crosses the threshold of not only are people willing to use it, but are they going to demand to use it? And so that might have been, you know, some of the things you might do to run an MVP like that is to, you know, let go of the training wheels a little bit, you know, when the program's still running. See if people are, you know, coming to it on their own volition, whether they are really, you know, putting in some friction to have them access it, and see if they come to you and say, hey, the website's down, like I really need this, right? And getting a sense of if this is really adding value to them, and if not, then figuring out, you know, what are their real needs, and how can this be something that they will really be demanding and upset if they don't have access to.
That's great. So a couple other kind of thoughts or questions. For me, one of the more provocative elements in the book is the assertion to kind of get to that hockey stick style growth. Like, we're never going to be able to get there on the back of grant funding. You showed the foreign aid charts earlier, and they're infinitesimally small. So the idea that if you want to achieve scale, real meaningful scale, you have to have a sustainable financial model, which almost always, I think your book suggests, will involve some sort of a profit capability to be able to scale it appropriately.
Not necessarily. So I think there's actually three primary paths to scale. One is the profit model, where, you know, the private sector model, that somebody makes a profit somehow and continues to keep it going. Another is the government path, right? That there's government adoption. It doesn't have to make a profit, but government spends a lot of money to provide basic social services to its citizens. So if you can more cost effectively deliver those services, or deliver something that prevents you from having to deliver services because that, you know, people became homeless or people went to prison or whatever, you can prevent those things. That's another way that government you can leverage government money. But government has a lot of money, and countries more and more have their resources to do this. So having government money get spent more effectively is another way. And the third path is replication or open sourcing things. So it can be something that is you figure out a great way to train people. I'm on the board of IREX, and they're figuring out how to train people to identify fake news. Like, if you open source something like that, then that's something that then lots of different organizations can use in the right form or fashion and fund in many different ways. So I think those are the three primary paths. There's some variations on the theme, though.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, that third one, everybody's in the kind of the save the world business, but it's very easy to get hung up on your intellectual property.
Right, that's a falling in love with your solution, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it feels like also a competitive advantage if you are competing with a rival NGO for a limited pool of government funding. The idea that you're going to share like your model, even though it may serve more people, can at times feel like like you're losing a competitive advantage. And did you have to grapple with that in government, or any thoughts on how to kind of deconflict some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a real question of, are you mission driven or are you organizational perpetuation driven? And I would argue that in this world, most organizations are more the latter. One of the challenges I like to throw out there to people is to say, okay, if you had this scenario where you had a grant opportunity in front of you, and you had an idea for how to deliver 30% greater impact with the grant. You were pretty convinced that you could deliver 30% greater impact, either by having like an innovation fund or by doing something, but you're coloring outside the lines of it. It's not exactly responsive to what the grant is. It's not dramatically non-responsive, but it's a little bit such that you think you might have a 10% less chance of winning the grant as a result. Would you do it? And I think very few organizations can say yes, if they're being honest with themselves, that if they're going to have a 10% less chance of winning the grant but 30% more impact, that they would take that reduced chance, because our organizations, our institutions are set up to perpetuate themselves, not to seek the greatest impact. And I think it's something that we need to ask our institutions to say, how do we shift ourselves to really put impact first?
Great. So I'm sure there's some questions out in the audience here. We'd love to open it up to y'all to ask Aunt Mei anything that may have come up, or any ideas or questions you might have. So we've got a couple mics that will be running around. So, and we've got a gentleman in the back with his hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I saw when you said how many people are in development here know about development. They all 90% raised their hand, right? I didn't. Because when I meet people in development, I ask them, what new ideas do you have? You have not said anything new because you're on the same assumption. I'm from Africa, so my critique will be those who are dealing with development in Africa. There are several assumptions being made. One, that these countries in Africa are sustainable as a political structure. That's the first thing you have to question. We were saying that in the 60s. I'm 76 years old. I was involved in a decolonization process in Africa. Secondly, you have to bring into your own mind what is called legacy thinking, perceptual set, all of those things. You have to bring it to the program to say, what I'm being told to accept and build strategy to solve the need may not be applicable in this situation. I want you all to start thinking in the light. We are raising the point where 2025, the 54 countries in Africa will become like America, political federation. Then you will see all the things that you're trying to do will be meaningful and could be scaled, and it could meet the needs of the people.
Thank you. Other questions? Great, we've got one down here. Was there another hand up over there? Okay, great. Well, you go ahead and stick your hands up, and I'll queue up a couple things if other people. Great.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and we're looking for what we call the 1,000 best solutions, best practices. And looking at this last comment that you made, Ann Mei, is about in-process successes or failures or assessments, looking at the way that you can move things forward. How would you take some of these little steps and say these are best practices? It's not like at the end of the 5 years you're talking about for the funding, we have the best practice, the big best practice. It may be 15 or 20 or 50 small best practices, but how do we get those out to the people and say, these little steps are important to get to the long-term goal? And then how do we allow people to have access to that so we're not just holding on to it until the very end so we can get it out? And thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a good question. I mean, part of it is knowing it, right? So a lot of times we don't know because we're not measuring those smaller steps, and that's like identifying those innovation metrics and optimizing for them. I was just talking to someone recently who was working with Educate Girls, who was the first organization that did the first development impact bond. And they were saying after this, they've been now using artificial intelligence to try to better target girls for education. And by doing so, they were able to reach, cut the cost in half or reach twice as many girls for the same cost by doing this, right? And so it's because they have this innovation metric of what's the cost per girl reached to identify the girls that could benefit from the program, and they optimize it. So that's a great learning. It's a great optimization. They have now an algorithm that's based on these different factors. You can tell whether this is the right girl to target. And so it's all those little optimizations added up that result in a program being transformative. I think we often think of a transformative program as like one big idea, but it's usually 100 small ideas. Google is considered, I think, one of the most innovative companies on the planet, but Google didn't invent search. It didn't, it was like Alta Vista and InfoSeek and all these companies we don't remember anymore. But what it did is it made like 1,000 improvements on search, probably more than that, on the algorithms, on the user interface, on the business model, and so forth, that led it to be heads and shoulders above the others. And for some reason in the global development space, we tend to think it's like a big idea that is the thing. And I tend to see it much more as lots of small ideas.
Hi, I'm Sarah Moulton. I work with Chris and Marty at NDI, but I'm also a former Mercy Corps person. So, and had the pleasure of working in Iraq for many years with them. And the point, first of all, also thank you for this. This is great. I love it. I really wish that development in general started looking more at this aspect, because some of the struggles that we had were really from a funder perspective of, okay, here's a lot of money, go implement this program and achieve these particular deliverables, and you have $35 million to spend and you need to do it within a year. And there isn't really a lot of incentive for changing that, changing how we report on that. And it's great that, you know, Global Development Lab and DIV are different mechanisms that kind of allow that iterative approach. But by and large, across the you know, State Department, USAID, it seems like it's still the process that you do need to kind of respond to these, what's very prescriptive RFP that comes out. Are you seeing any changes more widely across the agencies? Because it would be great if there were ways that, you know, you felt like you could respond to those. We went a little bit rogue in Iraq, where we decided not to actually just do infrastructure, but that was also helpful because USAID couldn't come visit our projects at the time. But it would be great to, you know, what do we do as implementers to really kind of move that needle from the agency side, and Congress also, because that's the expectation from Congress, that we hit these targets.
No, it's a great question. I think it's one of the biggest challenges, especially in the global development space, that keeps us from doing this, because I think, again, we all want to do this. This all makes sense, right? So on the NGO side, I think that we can try and color outside the lines a little bit. Like I said, you may not be able to have a completely, you know, innovation-driven program, but you could build in 1%, 5%, 10% of a program to try to build in your own innovation window. And it is a little bit of a risk, but I think it's a risk we need to all take. And if we are mission-driven, it's a risk I think we have the responsibility to take. And if we all start doing that, I think you know, they would become the norm. So that's something I think we can definitely do from the NGO side, is just start building in those innovation windows. I think there's good news on the funder side. You know, both USAID and DFID are doing a lot, and I'm sure a lot of the other funders as well, but I'm closest to them, are doing a lot to try to move in this direction. So at my book launch event at Brookings, I had Jim Richardson, who is the head of you know, one of the top political appointees at USAID in this administration, who's head of policy and budget. And he spoke on a panel afterwards, and he talked about like how USAID is moving in this direction. We're trying to mainstream the stuff with the lab. Their new guidance is that they're trying to get 30% of their procurements to be using innovative acquisition mechanisms. I'm sure they're not there yet, but it's a direction they're going. Even when I was at USAID, the new ADS 201 revisions came out that built adaptive management into the core of program design. I think my sense is that it's now become another checkbox that people fill, because there's actually a section where you have to fill in how my program's going to be adaptive. I'm not sure that people are actually taking advantage of it, but it's actually part of like what you're supposed to describe in your program design is how am I going to be adaptive? How am I going to learn and integrate it into the programming? So I think we need to recognize some of the changes that are happening and like embrace them also, instead of making them another checkbox.
Piggybacking on Sarah's question, like from the Iraq context, or there is so much of the work that has to be done, so many of the people who most need to be served who are in some of the most difficult places on earth. Any thoughts on how kind of lean impact applies in, you know, post-conflict transition or places with some of the most difficult infrastructural problems on earth?
Well, I think it's hard to generalize, but I would say that it's most needed in places like that. In fact, the most agile, nimble part of USAID is what's it? OTI. I'm forgetting my acronyms. I've been out of government too long. Is OTI, which works in these places, right? And the reason is that we know that we have to be much more nimble when we're working in these environments. So I'm happy to talk to a specific example, but I think that the more uncertainty there is, either and I think there's two types of uncertainty. One is uncertainty in the external environment, and one is uncertainty in our solution meeting the needs, right? But the more uncertainty there is in either of those dimensions, then you need to do more of this. And the more certainty there is, if you have a static environment and you have a solution that you know will solve the problem, then you need less of this.
Other questions? Yep, Priel.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and speaking with us. My question has to kind of follow on the organizational culture and change that's required to take a lean impact sort of approach in the point of mission-driven versus organizational-driven. What kind of advice or thoughts would you have on how we can be better champions within our organizations for this sort of approach and create that culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's an answer both bottoms up and a tops down answer, right? So the bottoms up answer is to start proposing these innovation windows, start trying to create the space within the constraints you have to work in, start running experiments. You can, I know a lot of organizations will spend budget to do field visits to try to prepare a proposal. When you're doing that, rather than just doing focus groups and writing designs, run an MVP, test out some of this stuff, get data. And so when you can come back to your organization and say, I tried doing this in these 3 different ways, and this way worked best, then I think you have something to build on, right? So again, don't feel like you have to have permission and do something really big. Try to do something in a small way, and that can be as simple as if you're trying to recruit people to training, describe the training in 3 different ways. There was this study in Zambia that the way that they recruited community healthcare workers, that they said it was about furthering your career versus doing good. One ended up having much better retention and much better results, right? So it can be simple things like that that you can do from the bottom up. From the top down, what I say is a lot of organizations talk a good game about being innovative, but mostly it's like PR, and it's a thing on the side that they do that generates the PR. So if you really care about innovative, I think you have to start out with the audacious goal, which is like, what is it you're really going to do? And that audacious goal has to be something you can't achieve with, there's 2 criteria. It has to be something you can't achieve with business as usual, not even close. So it's not possible to get there as business as usual. And the second is that you have to hold the organization accountable to it. It can't just be some like squishy vision out there. It has to be something that when you go to the board meeting, when you go to the weekly executive team meetings, it has to be something that people are talking about, and they have innovation metrics to measure progress towards getting there. And so having that goal and having the incentives, the measures to tell your progress against that goal, and then having the incentives to encourage people to make that progress, I think are the core elements that unlock innovation. Because if you can get to your goal with business as usual, like if your goal is, a lot of organizations will talk about innovation, talk about their big mission, but if you go to their board meeting or you go to their weekly executive team meeting, they're talking about what their grant pipeline is, right? It's not like, did we figure out how to serve each person for 20% less or 50% money, or did we figure out how to increase our success rate? It's like, what's our grant pipeline? And that's not how you're going to get to transformative change.
Hi, Ann May. Rob Sheehan, University of Maryland. Last night I was talking about your approach in a graduate class of students, and one of the things they were getting not hung up on but worried about was pivot versus persevere. And the concern they were sharing was senior leaders who would be so in love with their idea that they'd keep on persevering instead of pivoting when maybe they should. Any advice or guidelines on what to do at that point?
Yeah, and this is why I had the slide about focusing on the metrics that matter. Too often in this world, we rely on experts, academics or other experts who supposedly know best, and we take their word for it, or the hippo, the highest paid person in the room, right? And those are the people that decide what it is the right thing to do. So instead, we need to focus on the innovation metrics, right? And data can tell us whether something is working or not. So if we agree in advance, this is how we're gonna, this is what our goal is, this is how we're gonna decide whether we're making progress towards the goal, then we can look at the data and say, hey, is it working or not? And then that becomes a much more objective place to make that decision rather than based on what a funder like, what a particularly important person likes or otherwise.
Another question over there?
Yes, hi. I wondered about your example of the eyeglass company, and if you'd update us on how they're doing now. And to take this specific case, what would you be doing if you were calling the shots there now to move ahead in a bolder way?
Yeah, I mean, I think what they're doing, Vision Springs, they're a nonprofit, and they spun out another nonprofit called the iLines. That's this public-private partnership. And I actually just saw them also last week at Skull World Forum. I really believe in this, in the systems change approach that they're taking. I think they're doing the right thing. They're getting the government of Liberia to build in the funding into their budget in 2020 to fund integrating vision care into their healthcare system, their public school system. And that's how change is gonna happen. In their particular case for their particular problem, it's not necessarily the right solution for all problems. But they've looked at where the bottlenecks are, how people are gonna get reached, and are looking at how to get the system to work better.
2020 sounds like the right year to work on vision. Let's see, any other questions out there? Yep, in the middle.
Hi, thank you for being here. You touched a little bit on how the international development community is hesitant to admit failure or talk about failure, but generally we learn the most from failures. So how do we get to possibly normalizing, but almost even expecting failure as like a valuable expectation to this growth instead of something that we're like, oh no, failure, we didn't succeed, that means like bad, and change it to, oh, failure, how do we succeed? How do we learn from this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it has a lot to do with, I think the ability to fail has a lot to do with the ability to do things small. Part of the problem, I think a real root of the problem of why it's so hard to fail in international development is that the smallest step we know how to take is very big. And so when you fail, nobody wants to admit it because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time you spent, because the only step you can take is at least like a year, right? And so we need to figure out how to do things smaller. So if, for example, in my example of like handing out flyers, if you were to give out 2 different types of flyers and you found that, if you're a Harambe and you're trying to recruit youth to come to a training, this flyer gets 80% of youth come, this one gets 50% of youth to come, you found one that's better. Is that a failure? Like the 50% people coming one, it failed in a sense, but you wouldn't call it a failure because it's so small, right? And so the smaller you get something, the easier it is to fail, and we need to figure out the muscles to shrink down the amount of learning we're trying to get all at once to be smaller, so then we can fail. So like with DIV, this program at USAID, the Development Innovation Ventures, I went up to the Hill several times, and the Hill is not wild about agencies telling them they failed. But I went up to the Hill several times, and very clear, we placed all these bets, most of them failed, but they were $100,000 bets. Nobody was bent out of shape about it. And in fact, it was like refreshing to them because they never hear anybody tell them that they failed. All the agencies are telling them how great everything is. And so it was a great dialogue. We built great relationships based on this. And one of the staff people was like, hey, can I come work there? So I think we have to figure out how to take those small steps and be able to, then it's easier to talk about them, and it's easier to call them a learning rather than a failure.
One more for me here. The one challenge I think that we wrestle with sometimes is scale versus local capacity building. You know, the international development sector very focused, or it should be, on trying to empower people in their own environments to try and solve their own problems. But there's a little bit, especially when it comes to technology, there's a bit of a contradiction there. Like, you know, the right approach for Google was not setting up a separate Google in every country on earth. Any thoughts on how to achieve scale in a way that is empowering for local communities?
Yeah, I think that the two are actually fairly compatible, because a lot of the way we scale is not by having people here in DC who are paid exorbitant amounts of money compared to the people who are in these countries come up with all this stuff and do all this stuff, but because one, we're too expensive if we want to get the costs down, and two, we just don't know the local environment well enough. So I think it often is bringing together both the capacity, because we do have more capacity to develop technology, for example, just to use that example, but a lot of the technologists don't have a good enough idea of what's needed in those communities. So bringing those together will get you to the best solutions.
And kind of continuing on that, one challenge I think sometimes we see is you can implement technologies, but the long-term sustainability is a challenge, because the international development and the grant-based system is based on fixed cycles. You do a 3-year program, a 5-year program. At the end of that, you turn out the lights and walk away, and then the partner is supposed to just kind of carry it forward on their own. That's particularly challenging when it comes to hard technology programs. Working with Lawyers for Human Rights in Zimbabwe, they didn't get into that business as a backdoor to learn how to be a Linux systems administrator. So that kind of technology handoff tends to be a failure. Any thoughts on how those sorts of things work in the development space today?
Yeah, I think that it's always like an afterthought how we're going to keep things going and how we're going to scale things. It's like, let's pilot something, let's try to see if it works, and then once it works, it's like, okay, now how are we going to scale it? And by the time your program's over, your funding's over. What I would argue is instead we need to make that, we need to think about growth from the very beginning, not at the very end once you've achieved impact, but at the very beginning. And what that means is, in your program, if you have a 3 to 5 year program and you know that you want it to persist after you, focus less on what you delivered during the program and more on what the program's going to deliver after. And if you think about it that way and you measure yourself based on testing, is this going to persist after me? I know it's going to end, and I'm not focused on did I reach 10,000 people, 20,000 people, whatever you're trying to do, but focused on am I able to step out of this, and is the local partner able, have the capacity, and are they maintaining, and do we have a business model that's going to continue to fund itself, and those kinds of things, you're far more likely to be able to get to scale. Too often it's like, oh, look, our program's ending in 6 months, what are we going to do?
Awesome. Okay, Mei Chang, thank you so much for your time here today. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Of course. All these lessons and more are available in the books out there, and so we'll be hanging out for a bit with Mei Chang and the books. Shameless personal plug, NDI will be hosting an event that we hope reflects some of these lessons learned as we launch a new round of our Democracy Toolkit, a bunch of software applications. Will be for social impact. So we'll be sending you all a follow-up with a little bit of information about that event, which is next week on Wednesday at Google. Hope to see you all again there. Thank you again.
Yeah, and I'll come up there and happy to sign anybody's books, and also happy to answer any other questions you have. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.